Good afternoon, everybody. And I just wanted to mention, I have a bit of voice dysphonia. So if I sound nervous or anxious, I'm not, but I do have voice dysphonia. Okay. So the first thing is I just wanted to go over the agenda of what we're going to be covering. And I know I have a very limited amount of time, and we're going to be covering a lot of concepts in a very short amount of time. So we're going to be looking at key terms and also definitions of the concepts that we're going to be talking about, where we are and where we were and where we are, the good and the bad, and I'm going to suggest some way forward for how the concepts of open source intelligence and open source should go for humanity. Okay, so the first thing is some of these have already been covered in the conference. I know that somebody already gave a definition of, in fact, Amanda Brock did on the first day on what is open source. I heard somebody else already give a definition of what is open data. So I don't think that I need to cover those too close. I'm not going to cover those because they've already been defined. But I would like to provide some definitions for the other concepts that we're going to talk about today. So the first is open source information. Open source information is any attainable information that you can get that is in the wild legally. Okay? It is not a news query. It can be. It can also be metadata or openly available disallow files. That's all open source information. Okay. Public information is information that is intended to be public. Proprietary information is usually corporate information, not typically government information, because governments usually refer to it as confidential or classified information. But proprietary information a lot of times has a legal implication to it, or an agreement between two parties or multiple parties that information will be contained within that cluster. And then you have the Internet of Everything, which is how the internet has extended to other things in our life, whether it be your garage door opener or your Roomba or your car. And yes, people can hack cars. The other thing I wanted to talk about, just as far as definition, is tools. Tools I do not look at as information. Tools are something that you can use to collect information, process information, and to use for enriching or opposite. You can actually use tools to be counter-enriching to information. Artificial intelligence, I saw some excellent presentations on that prior to this presentation, so I'm not going to go deeply into that, but I'm just going to say that there is a wide myriad of artificial intelligence that's available, and I will be mentioning some AI as it relates to deep fakes today. And then tradecraft, again, it's not information. Tradecraft is the process or the means and methodologies that you would use for attaining or collecting information, typically for requirement. And then open source intelligence is like this depicted picture. And I stress this because in today's society, open source intelligence has become a buzzword, and I will hear people say, oh, I looked up person on this individual, so I did open source intelligence. No, you didn't. Okay, I queried something in Google. I OSINT'd it. No, you didn't. Okay, so in OSINT is the soup. Okay, it is not the ladle, it is not the bowl. And I think I have a thing there, sorry. It is not the ladle, it is not the bowl, it is not the egg, it is not anything surrounding the bowl, okay? It is the actual complete soup itself. And what that means is that when somebody does OSINT, they typically have a requirement. They are answering that requirement. They have used tradecraft, or they have a plan to get to that answer, okay? And it's not just simply just pulling data here and there. But what has happened that's very interesting with open source intelligence is historically, open source intelligence was more for governments and for competitive business intelligence. Okay, that's just more traditional historical use for OSINT. What has happened is because of the availability of data and the availability of information and the availability of communication and the availability of venues and things on the internet, is that we now have lots of people that have become OSINT enthusiasts and OSINT practitioners, many of which are not in a government or in a company. So that can be used for good, and that can also be used for bad. The other thing that I wanted to mention that OSINT absolutely 100% is not is, and I've had this argument with somebody, OSINT is not doxing. So can I theoretically go and pull information on somebody, where they live, what their license plate number is, what their telephone number is, how old they are, who they're married to, what their kids' names are, so on and so forth? Theoretically, yes. Okay, that's not OSINT, that's doxing. It's unethical. Okay, so what has happened, though, again, is not only has OSINT evolved, the concept of doxing has evolved. So as I mentioned the other day when I was on panel with Salona, is that we now have a precedence in society where you can weaponize doxing on a nation-state level. GDPR is a nice thing in the sense that GDPR has been put in place in the EU to help try and protect citizens from this kind of activity. But if you look at what happened in Ukraine, we had hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers on both sides of the conflict that have been posted online with their passport numbers, their family names, their addresses, their rank, what they look like, so on and so forth. Okay? It's good for whoever is doing it in the sense that they now have a competitive advantage in the battlefield. But the bigger question is, we now have a new weapon on a nation-state level. And not only do we have a new weapon on a nation-state level, that new weapon doesn't have to be done by a government. A government theoretically can just instigate it if they want to. They can crowdsource it if they want to. All right. Oops. I keep bumping something on here. Oops, sorry about that. Technical difficulty for a second. So as I said, there are unintended consequences for all of these things, doxing just being one example. So open data can be a wonderful and beautiful thing, and I am all for open data. Okay. At the same time, you do have to be careful at what that open data contains. If that open data contains PII, then yes, you should take the PII out prior to making it open. Open source, the software in and of itself, something can be created for good, okay? And at the same time, it can be used for bad. And I'll use a case example. In 2008, when I was working as a contractor for the 304th MI Battalion at Fort Huachuca, I did a little article. It was a draft article. It was for official use only, Al-Qaeda-like capabilities, anomalous uses of Al-Qaeda-like capabilities. I had a little section in there in 2008 on Twitter and whether or not terrorists theoretically could use Twitter. That article got picked up by the Federation of American Scientists, and then it went to Wired, and then it went to BBC. Okay. There you go. But at that time, there was it was Stephen Aftergood from FAS. He actually critiqued my article, and I disagreed with his critique, and I still disagree with his critique today. He said, well, terrorists can use can openers. Okay, yeah, they can. But wouldn't you like to know if they would want to use one? And for what? Right? That's a reasonable question, I think. So in any case, the same concept applies with open source. There has to be a responsibility by not just the developer, but by the community to look at the open source package that they're putting out and to use OSINT and red team it and say, how can this be used? Can it be weaponized? It's a reasonable question, isn't it? And the same thing goes with open APIs. So that brings me to the next point, which is tradition to modern data and information ingredients. So historically, and yes, I have gone dumpster diving, it's fun. Historically, for OSINT or for information collection, we've had libraries. Before that, we had rock tablets, okay? Print publications, photos, art, as I mentioned, garbage. Radio, you would be amazed what you can get from somebody's garbage, okay? I used it as a student class example. My students loved it. Then you have radio, TV, internet, virtual reality, the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things gets really interesting when you're doing OSINT and you use a tool that's called Wiggle or any Wiggle-like tool, because then you realize how vulnerable people really are in IoT. Then you have artificial intelligence. I just had a class. I work with this wonderful lady. Her name is Kirby Plessas. She's awesome. She is an OSINT subject matter expert, and she did this great class where she did a GANs-generated image. Then she combined it with using DALL-E on how to make a completely non-existent person, which for right now, you can't use AI to detect that it is AI. So even though you might have a tool to detect that something is GANs generated, once you take it and you play with it and you play with it again, that cross detection disappears. So then you have other things like metadata. Oh, I love metadata. Metadata is great. If somebody has their EXIF data in a photo, who has their phone GPS enabled? Okay, if you do and you just want to have fun, you can send me a photo. Satellite imagery, and this was an example I used to use at Fort Huachuca when I was teaching OSINT at Fort Huachuca. Satellite imagery back then, this was a long time ago, this was like in 2010, 2009, 2008, up to 2010. It used to be you had to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for a satellite image. Now anybody can go get one, right? So that gives you an idea that all of this stuff has now become available to everyone. So it's no longer limited to a few, which again, then you have to look at whenever you put something out, am I weaponizing it? I have actually self-censored myself on publishing an article, okay? I've censored it up until Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I'm going to be still writing an article, and it could be like a little blog post, so not in any big publication, but I had written an article, and I'm going to put it into a fictional case example. So you have country A. Country A has different laws for each state. Now we know who country A is, but that's okay. So country A has different laws for each state. The privacy is different for each state. And some cities within country A have areas that have different kinds of population that are affiliated to one type of industry or another. Then you have country B. Country B is for an adversary. Country B is going to use an AI tool. And country B is going to go walk over with their AI tool, and they're going to grab the county open data county property records from one state within country A. They've now scraped information on thousands, if not millions, of citizens in one county in country A. Is it possible? You betcha. That brings me to this example really quick. This is an example of OSINT and open source for bad. This is taken from the third position directory, which is a neo-Nazi directory. It is advertised on Twitter. The reason it's advertised on Twitter is because Elon Musk currently allows Nazis to operate on Twitter. So this is of interest because this directory has OSINT tools, open source OPSEC, operational security tools, and it has open source tools. There's actually tools in there that have been developed that are being targeted for extremists, for extremist use, for data collection. So that's bad. Now, I don't want to talk about all-time bad because, frankly, I get bored of talking about all the stuff bad. I've looked at tons of stuff bad, okay? And I've done a whole chapter of a book in 2002 on how terrorists use the internet. That was for the International Encyclopedia of Terrorism. I've looked at thousands of terrorist websites. Okay, I'd like to look at how to use this stuff for good instead of just bad. So OSINT and open source software is critical, absolutely critical, for national security, law enforcement, of course, with some caveats and to make sure that the law enforcement is under the rules and regulations that they should be under, human rights, environment, research and climate change, missing persons and human trafficking. And by the way, if you're ever bored, there's a CTF, a Capture the Flag event, that is done by some folks online where they crowdsource OSINT practitioners and hackers to help find missing people. Kind of cool. Done it a couple times, didn't do very well, but at least I helped. Anti-corruption and fraud, safety operations and missions, identifying vulnerabilities with open source. Again, this is critical. If anybody is doing open source as far as a program, they should have somebody in OSINT see whether or not they can exploit it. And if so, for what? Okay. Hardening privacy and personal safety. And then the last one that we are really faced with right now, which is huge, is enhancing cognitive security on national, regional, and global levels. My first presentation that I did on online indoctrination and recruitment as it related to extremism was in 2010, where it was to a large audience. I'd done some for some smaller audiences. And at that point, I gave a presentation in Singapore as a guest of the State Department at a conference. And the indoctrination and recruitment example that I provided was a UK-based extremist who had a chat platform where he was openly talking back and forth with people to recruit, and nobody was shutting him down. We have a disparity today, I would argue, in extremisms. So we are not allowing recruitment indoctrination of extremism toward one group of extremists, but we are allowing it toward another group of extremists. To me, extremism is extremism. I don't care if it's a white supremacist or Al-Qaeda, it's still an extremist. Okay. So we then need to look at how should we react? I don't know. That's a question, that's a much bigger question than for me. But if we continue to look just within our own ecosystem, or if we're only looking for the things that you want to eat, and you're not paying attention to the things as far as the data you want to consume, and you're not paying attention to how others are using that data or how it might be used outside of that ecosystem, then you're opening yourself up to that vulnerability. So Data credibility and reliability in the age of deep fakes and mass information manipulation, that's now. I mean, it's not yesterday, it's not the day before, or it's not tomorrow, it's now, okay? So when we're looking at things like cognitive security, you can deepfake a leader of a country. It's already been done. The one that was done by Zelensky, though, that one was just really, really done poorly. I don't even think that was done by the Russian government. I saw somebody say it was done by the Russian government, but I'm thinking, man, the skill set on that one was really bad. But someone can do better. So here's the ending of my presentation, and I hope that I haven't taken too much of anybody's time. But I do have some way forward thoughts. And again, I'm just a small fish in a much bigger sea. But I think for the open source community, whether it be on a chapter level or a business level or regional level or a city level or a state level or a government level, I think the first is that we have to look at is decrease the disparity between data on open source and on the haves and have-nots. So if 63% of people have access to the internet and the other percent doesn't have access to the internet, well, the other part of the population doesn't have access to the same data. Okay. Ecosystems are often interconnected. That should always be considered. There is no, unless you're, okay, there's an exception. It's like, let's say you work for the government and you're in a skiff. Maybe that ecosystem is finite or it's stovepiped. But if it's not stovepiped or finite, then there's no, you need to look at how things are interconnected. And what is that ripple effect? What's going to happen with that ripple? Okay, I sometimes purposely cause ripples. Sometimes they're very effective. I've gotten a few people removed from Twitter. I'm not going to say who. All right. Create and enhance ethical frameworks and models for data and open source tooling. I had a debate with some folks the other day on OSINT, and I asked, what's your ethical framework? If somebody can't answer, what's your ethical framework for a study or a collection plan? That's an issue. Okay? Same thing for open source, if it's an open source project. Okay? And I think people who create open source projects should think about, is this going to be curated? And if it is going to be curated, what are my caveats for that? Okay. The other thing is, I think that it's really important in today's age, because we are past just libraries and things on pulp, is there needs to be a very established relationship and a stronger bridge between people within the open source intelligence community, people within the open source community, and people within data communities. We should have a collaborative community. We should all be meeting together and see how things interconnect and see how we can help each other. I think that there needs to be an enhanced education and awareness. I think that that enhanced education and awareness needs to go everything from, I think it's great that there's coding for kids. That's awesome. Okay, but I think that also needs to go to a greater emphasis on also cognitive security and how to do analysis and what is the analytical reasoning for why that code should be there in the first place. What betterment to humanity is it going to create? Oop. And the last three are open source can provide a foundation for projects and programs for good. I know that I'm not with Bellingcat, but Bellingcat I know has actually set aside a whole section of their team to make open source software for human rights investigations. That model is pretty cool, okay? Curation should be done by trusted agents, not just anyone. So if you're working on a project and you're on a nation state level, is that the nation state you want doing the curation? I don't know, depends what it is. And then open data and OSINT can and does assist open source and vice versa. I hope I didn't go over.